Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Compliance Week in OnSpring. I'm Kyle Brasser, Digital Editor with Compliance Week, and I'll be your host. Today's webcast is a comprehensive view of the Compliance Initiative. Before we hear from our presenter, let me review the agenda. We're scheduled to go for 1 hour. After the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. Your questions will be kept confidential and anonymous, so please don't be shy. You can ask your questions at any time using the Ask a Question function on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll pose them to our guest at the end of his presentation. After the Q&A, I'll wrap up the webcast. This webcast will also offer CPE credit for all attendees. Please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. To obtain your CPE credit, wait until the webcast is completely over and I sign off. At that point, the final examination will be presented automatically in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send an email to info@complianceweek.com. I'll repeat these instructions at the end of the webcast, so if you missed anything, stay tuned. A few other administrative details. At any time during the presentation, listeners can download the slides from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side of your screen. There you will also find the feedback form for the webcast. We welcome your thoughts as we are always looking to improve your experience. If you wish to increase the slide size, you can also hit the Use Slide Full Screen button at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a Help button is located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for assistance. I'd like to welcome today's speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason Rolfe. As Vice President of Solutions for OnSpring, Jason is responsible for designing and developing OnSpring Solution Suite, providing sales support and domain expertise, and driving the company's go-to-market strategy. Leveraging 20 years of internal audit, compliance, GRC, software, and consulting experience, Jason helps organizations of all shapes and sizes to solve business challenges, gain efficiencies, and work to their full potential. It's great to have him with us, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jason to get us started.
Great. Well, thank you, Kyle. Really appreciate that, and want to say thank you to everyone who took the time to be with us today. Certainly a big thanks to Compliance Week for allowing us to chat with you today. So like Kyle said, my name is Jason Rolfe. Just a little bit of background about me, just so you know who's going to be talking to you today, getting a sense of whether or not you should listen to me. My experience is primarily, as Kyle said, started off in the internal audit world. Spent about 12 and a half years doing internal audit, making sure that organizations were complying with all of their standards and guidelines, and it was really a great way to sort of learn the organization to enter into the business world. And along with that, definitely had some experience just naturally being in internal audit with risk management concepts, with compliance concepts, maybe dating myself a little bit here, but was in the internal audit world when year one of Sarbanes-Oxley kicked off, for example. So fondly remember those times and really appreciate the opportunity that being in internal audit gave me to be able to see the organization from a lot of different perspectives. In the last 9 years or so, I kind of took that perspective, that experience I had, and as I always like to say, I turned it about 90 degrees and just started looking at it from a different perspective. So stepping out of the traditional practitioner role, I really kind of transitioned into a role where we can help the industry, help assurance functions, help them with solutions, figuring out new and better ways to manage their data, to manage their information, to manage their processes, and to get real insight and fine-tuned information out of that. So I think by my calculations, I've worked longer than the 10,000 hours. Not to say that I'm the end-all, be-all expert, but certainly have seen a lot of different approaches, whether it's through internal audit or those compliance roles, or in my role in software or in consulting. Really, the goal of today is not for me to tell you how to do things, right? The real goal is for me to share one set of experiences, to give you guys a roadmap or a guideline or a thought process that can help you kind of structure how you approach your compliance initiative, specifically from how you structure the data, how you take advantage of the data, and let it really work for you and give you the insight you need into the process. So look at this as really, a guideline for compliance, regardless of what that overarching initiative is. Okay, well, let's take a look at today's agenda. So I'm a firm believer in breaking things down into simple parts, and the goal of this presentation is really to do just that. Let's keep it to a simple agenda. So first, we're going to sort of revisit the fundamental definition of an internal control and really just focus on understanding why we implement them in the first place, right? Start with why. From there, we'll introduce the control library concept, how to structure, capture, manage all of your key data points, and explore some of the pitfalls, some of the benefits to maintaining a structured approach to addressing your internal control environment. As we do that, we're going to also highlight some key interrelationships of data between your system of internal controls and other elements of your organization. Really exploring the driving purpose of creating these key interrelationships and talk about and discuss some of the benefits you stand to gain by thinking about things in this regard. We also want to discuss the testing concept, this concept of trust then verify, including the drivers that will allow you to help scope your controls, some of the different testing considerations and approaches, and why it's important to stay on top of those issues that you identify. Really just kind of giving all of that context. And then finally, we'll talk about visualizing the results, really bringing everything together by exploring some compelling reports and analysis tools that might help you take the data that you've captured and really convert it into useful information that's useful by everyone, regardless of what their position is within the organization. Okay. So I said I like to start simple, so let's start really simple. Let's think about the what and the why of internal control. So what I have here is a very basic definition of an internal control, and this is my overly simplistic definition of a control based on all of the information that I've researched and gathered. So if you think about it, it's a process affected by leadership designed to accomplish an objective. So just to give a little bit of something away, for those of you familiar with the COSO model, this will probably look very familiar. So let's break this down into its component parts. So a process, that simply means, what is the thing you are doing? Is it a policy you've implemented? Is it a procedure? Is it a meeting? Maybe it's a rule or a configuration that's been embedded within your application or a review process, but something that's actually being done to help achieve that objective. Leadership. Again, this is kind of tipping my hat to COSO a little bit, but in terms of leadership, it's those individuals or those groups of individuals within your organization who basically direct those actions of the organization, who have been given the stated or implied authority to drive the actions that the organization takes. So an internal control is something that management or the board or some leader in our organization is really instructing us to do. And then to accomplish a specific objective. So you can see the three most common ones that are presented here: the efficiency and effectiveness of operations, the financial reporting reliability, and certainly compliance with any applicable laws and regulations. So as we look at this breakdown, right, breaking this down into its more component parts, I want to come back to this concept of COSO and actually the definition that they prescribe, which is a control is a process affected by an entity's board of directors, management, and other personnel designed to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in these categories, and I won't reread those categories. Now, you can see COSO goes a little bit further than my definition, but that's, I think, by design. They're calling out who's ultimately responsible for effecting the control, as well as giving you specific reasons why you might want to put that control in place. But if you really think about, objective, right? Objectives can certainly go beyond those three objectives that we've presented here, right? It's not just about these three things. You could argue or maybe get a little bit more detailed and say, I'm going to put in a control to respond to a risk, right? One of those threats or opportunities that we're dealing with. Maybe it's to prevent fraud or to safeguard assets or to ensure the achievement of a strategic objective. I think the real important point here is, as you're defining your controls, as you're defining what those things in your organization, those processes that have been affected by leadership are, it's really understanding the why. What is the compelling reason why this control has been put into play? Because as you'll see, as we kind of start going through and deconstructing and dissecting exactly what makes up your control library, what those key critical relationships are, understanding that why is going to have an impact on a number of things down the road. Okay, so just to take the COSO model a little bit deeper, because let's face it, COSO is really one of the most widely accepted internal control frameworks. I think because we're taking the time to break down the why, to break this into its simple parts, let's explore the 5 critical components of COSO and kind of what they mean to us. So we'll start with control environment. So everyone on the phone has likely heard the phrase, the tone at the top, right? Controls that fall within the control environment really set the tone for your organization. Now, these controls may seem to be a little bit more intangible, a little bit more difficult to measure in some cases. However, they are essential and foundational to establishing an effective system of internal controls because they really set the foundation for everything that comes after them. So when you think about some of these examples, and you know, as I start to talk through these, you'll understand this concept of, hey, these are a little bit more intangible and difficult to measure. The integrity, the ethical values, the morale, the competence of the employee. I mean, that's a mouthful. That's a lot to deal with there. But if you think about it, what is the moral makeup of your organization, right? What is the ethical makeup of your organization? What is the standard or the expectation that's set? The style of management. Is it authoritative? Is it collaborative? Are employees encouraged to speak up, or are they really kind of resigned to doing what they're told? It could also be your organization structure. For example, are there clear assignment of authorities, duties, and responsibilities? Do people in the organization actually understand what their role is in the organization? Do they understand why the things they're being asked to do are important? Right? Are all of these critical responsibilities clearly assigned? You could also be talking about things that kind of fall outside the realm of the organization's control. For example, the industry or the business environment in which the organization operates, the economic or regulatory events that are kind of directing or driving what's happening in the organization, as well as the attentiveness of governing bodies. And I'll tell you, I picked that word attentiveness up from COSO. I really like it because attentiveness to me in this situation means how tightly are they turning those thumb screws on you. And those of you in the financial services industry can probably speak very well to that. Okay, risk assessment. So this control category really deals with the organization's ability to set clear operating goals and objectives, and then identify those threats, those opportunities that can either impede or enhance the achievement of those objectives. So when we were talking about the definition of internal control, risk management is one of those reasons why you might want to put a control into place. In this case, it's not just implementing a series of risk management controls and just kind of letting them hum in the background or leaving them be. This is something that definitely needs to be a little bit more ongoing in nature. There are going to be more fine-tuning and adjustments to your risk assessment type controls because the situations are changing. So think about this as sort of measuring the pulse of what's happening in the organization and that being sort of a key objective. Okay, everybody's favorite, control activities. This is, just based on what I understand about control activities, this seems to be the category that's very much in the front of people's minds where they're thinking, oh, internal controls. These are the things that we're doing, right? These are the actual processes, policies, procedures that have been put into place to help affect and kind of drive home the control environment and that tone at the top. These are the things that are, the offshoot or the byproduct or the result of risk assessment. So you can even see that COSO does a great job of laying things out in a very logical order. Information and communication. So this clearly concerns the way in which this critical information that you're gathering through your compliance process is communicated to the organization. Imagine that. Information and communication is about information being communicated. But it's really essential, right? Does everybody receive the same message? Is everybody receiving that message in a clear, consistent, and timely manner? Is it easy to decipher? So if you're going to rely on individuals in your organization to make critical decisions that impact the direction of the organization, you really want to make sure that they're getting good, clean, reliable information and that it's being given to them in a easy to decipher manner, in a timely manner. And then monitoring, the last primary category of the COSO controls. So all internal control systems and processes are going to change over time. So because of this, controls need to be monitored. They need to be adjusted and tweaked, but then those tweaks need to be monitored so that everybody understands, oh, okay, this is how the control needs to operate going forward. So if you think about it, this is typically done in two ways. One may be on an ongoing basis, and another may be on a periodic basis. Ongoing monitoring can just be a natural part of the process. I'm reviewing, I'm monitoring, I'm making sure that all of the metrics are kind of indicating that this control or this process is operating as intended. Sort of the point-in-time monitoring might be done by external parties, external auditors or regulators, or internal auditors, peer reviewers, or through a self-assessment process. So really the main reason I wanted to go through and reiterate the understanding of these COSO components and even define what a control is in the first place, because it comes down to fundamentals. Right? In the sports world, they always talk about fundamentals, blocking and tackling, or throwing and catching, basic stuff like that. But really, no matter what the initiative is that you're trying to comply with, everything that we've talked about in the last two slides is really going to serve as that critical foundation for being able to demonstrate that you are indeed achieving those objectives. Okay, so let's talk about control library, right? We understand the reason why we have controls. We understand how we can categorize them and the various reasons why they might be in place. So if I think about, getting back to the internal audit experience and the consulting experience and working in the software world, if you think about the current state of internal controls, what do you guys suspect is the most common approach? Well, you guys are all on mute, so that's a rhetorical question. But I would suspect that most people would probably think spreadsheets are the most common approach. You get to see my excellent PowerPoint skills at display there as well. Spreadsheets, absolutely. So, open up a spreadsheet, start document the control library, capture all the data elements, right? Very easy, very simple. We've all done it. Now, before I go any further here, I want to stress my purpose here is not to pick on Excel. In some cases, Excel is a great approach for what we're talking about here. In fact, I will go so far as to say is I love Excel, I use it every single day, and I don't think I could do my job without it. It's tremendously flexible, manageable, and valuable. And I certainly understand why people rely on this, right? Why they use it to capture a control library or document their controls. You open up an Excel spreadsheet, you have instant data structure. It's easy to implement columns and rows, and if you know how to do formulas and VLOOKUPs and macros and pivot tables, there's lots of cool stuff you can do with Excel. However, and you knew there'd be a however, but when it comes to managing all of the critical aspects of your system of internal controls, there are some very definitive concerns that we at least need to address and that you're likely going to encounter if you're adopting an Excel-only approach. So the first would be sort of this concept of a one-and-done nature. Now, this isn't so much about the concept of documenting your controls in a control library spreadsheet. What I'm thinking about, though, is that a control is sort of a living, breathing thing. The wording of the control is going to change. Ownership is going to shift. We're going to test it at various points in time. We're going to use it to help run analytical procedures in the audit process. So the most concerning aspect of this Excel-based approach is that one-and-done nature of the analysis. If you're producing a standalone file as support for these critical analytical procedures, or if you're trying to cram in a bunch of test results into a single cell and trying to parse that data out and mine it for reporting, you're likely performing adequate due diligence as of that point in time. But what ends up happening is the results of your hard work rarely, if ever, sort of last beyond the conclusion of an engagement, or they become very difficult to parse out and report on. What that does is it makes it really difficult to identify key trends, to monitor the impact of changes within your control environment, to identify some of those pervasive issues that may exist, which is really precisely why your organization is relying on assurance functions and even putting controls into place, to begin with. Another kind of issue that I see here is, thinking about going through and testing the controls is if you're going to separate key data points. So maybe I'm documenting my testing in some other individual spreadsheet, Or maybe, as issues or gaps in a process are identified, it's very common for the evaluator to populate and manage them in a separate Excel file or in some other database. Again, this is going to detract from your ability to properly manage the extent and the status of the issues in the context of the process elements in which they were identified. So in the context of that control, in the context of the broader process or the risk, right? Some of those things start to break down as you start to pile it all into one place and or separate that data into different tables. A third point would be really collaboration struggles. So storing this critical information, whether it's a library or a test result or what have you, storing that in a single file or a single location like Excel tends to make it more difficult for multiple individuals to access and interact with the data. I'm sure there's many people on the call who have been in that situation where there's a common Excel file that's shared on a SharePoint site, and the act of checking that file out or trying to access it on a remote server just creates all kinds of nightmares. And then there's replication conflicts. There's other concerns around, do all of these people really need to have the ability to edit every cell in this? So now you're starting to worry about, implementing tight little controls around every field, which can be very cumbersome. So given that most assurance functions are relying on a good deal of collaboration, review, coordination, this can create an accessibility and quality nightmare. And then finally, just, we're all humans. We all want to enjoy ourselves at work. Nobody wants to have a bad time, right? From a user-friendliness standpoint, I already talked about how building that initial control library or a risk control matrix is nice and simple and intuitive when you first open up Excel. The problem is that sometimes making changes, updates, modifications can prove to be quite difficult. So for example, in situations where there are merged cells, everyone has probably seen something where you've merged the cells on the process and now you've got your 4 controls related to it. Well then, if you want to insert a new control or you want to reorder those controls in terms of their current level of importance, that's something that really often creates a lot more work than is actually necessary. So again, not here to totally trash Excel, even though I just kind of trashed Excel. It's one of those things that definitely has its use and definitely has its usefulness. We're just trying to think a little bit broader here of what you guys are trying to accomplish. So if I'm going to bring up an issue or a problem, it would behoove me to bring up some sort of a solution, right? So in the interest of full disclosure, and as you guys all know, I do work for a software company, and our tool does provide users with a dynamic user interface that sits on top of a relational database. So I'm big on this relational database concept. That concept may be really simplistic to some folks, and it's maybe more advanced to others. And really, I'm not looking to give a full-blown description of how a relational database works. And certainly the point that I'm trying to drive home today is not use this system versus that system. Instead, it's really about touting the benefits of using a central tool that does allow you to work the way that you expect to work, while also ensuring that you can properly control and manage your data, manage its integrity, provide appropriate access, and manage that system of internal controls in a way that allows you to consistently gain and build insight into its overall performance. That's the most important thing. So as we do that, let's talk about some of the, if we think about this from a relational database standpoint, we're just going to talk about some of the basic fundamental bits and pieces that you're going to want to gather as you build up a full-blown control record. So first would be some sort of unique identifier. How will you differentiate this control from the others in your organization? If you are going to capture this in a database, this is of primary and significant importance. You want to be able to decipher, hey, this is this record. Now, I've seen this done all sorts of ways, whether it's a random number assigned by a system, or you have a numbering convention, or maybe it's some combination of a control number and the organization to which the control relates. That doesn't matter. As long as you've got some way to uniquely identify that control, you're going to be able to kind of treat it as its own entity. Now, some of these may seem pretty basic and straightforward, but they are worth mentioning. A title and a description, something that provides a clear and concise description of the control, and that gives a casual user enough information to understand the control's construct. So this could also include any other sort of data elements or data tags that help you classify that control, but we'll certainly get to that in just a little bit. The purpose, right? And when I say purpose, it's not just having a text field that says, this is the purpose of the control, but you really want to understand, why does this control exist? What is the context, the organizational context in which this control exists? Right? What is the goal that we're trying to accomplish, or the objective that we're trying to accomplish here? And really, what we're gonna, it's really about thinking, what are the objectives that were outlined in that COSO definition? What are the drivers to have this control in place? So it could be an individual description of a purpose, or it could be a much broader, relationship to other data points, which we'll certainly talk about. It's assumed that if you're going to put these controls into place, at some point you're going to want to go and validate that they're working as intended. So when I say testing approach, if we're going to validate that this control is indeed operating as it's intended, what are those criteria against which we're going to evaluate it? Assessment. Now, this is not an assessment of the control itself. This rather refers to employing a method or some level of methods to determine how critical this control is in the context of your organization. And again, we're going to share some ideas around this in the next slide. And a lot of it comes back to those objectives. Why is this control in place? Well, that's going to drive how critical or how non-critical that control might be from an evaluation perspective. I mentioned other key attributes, but when I talk about other key attributes, I'm really thinking, what other information do you need to sort of have at the ready about this control? Or what else might drive your testing process? Is it an automated control? Is it a manual control? How frequently is it performed? Think about the things that drive your reporting needs or that impact the nature and extent of testing, and capturing that in a structured manner allows you to stay consistent. And then last but certainly not least, ownership, right? If we get all the way back to that slide about COSO, where we talked about, affected by the board of directors and management, they're essentially leadership in the organization saying, you guys need to do these things because they are critical to achieving our most important objectives. So understanding, who owns the control, upon whom are you relying to execute the control? Really, this is about driving accountability. So if we look at all of these things in tandem, there's our control library, right? And this is not, again, meant to be the end-all, be-all. Certainly, everyone on this call can probably think of something that I've missed here, or can argue against a certain piece of this information. So the real point that I want to drive home on this is, when you're considering the key data elements that need to be captured, using some sort of relational database really kind of provides definitive benefits by enabling you to examine multiple sides of this control relationship, or how this control is impacting your organization. So in this next slide, we're going to actually explore a few examples of that. Okay. So key interrelationships, right? Controls can't exist in a vacuum. Right? Given that they're in place, we know to accomplish these objectives, we want to make sure we can understand and demonstrate the context in which they exist. So if I get back to this concept of a relational database, leveraging a relational database allows you to document and maintain the individual components of your organization and place them into the overall context of your compliance program. So it's kind of a two-way street here. It's, why has this control been put into place? Well, to satisfy or accomplish these objectives. And then if I'm concerned with how well or how poorly we're meeting an objective, the performance of the control can help me, or the set of controls can help me demonstrate that. So if we look at this little diagram, very simplistic and certainly not all-inclusive. But essentially what we see here is we see controls sitting at the center of it all. And just a few different examples, and I should have shrunk that text down on organizational units. So I think you guys get the idea there, so apologize for that. But just looking at 4 basic examples of why might we put a control in place, right? What are the driving reasons why we put a control in place, and what do we stand to gain by having these relationships in place? So let's just kind of go one by one. And let's start with the most obvious, policies and regulations, right? What are those internal policies or standards that you guys have set as an organization, and or what are those external drivers, whether those be laws or regulatory requirements or best practices or what have you. What are those internal policies or external regs that I need to demonstrate compliance with, right? So having this information in a relational database would essentially allow me to define a single internal control that can satisfy multiple objectives. So the execution, the documentation, the testing of that one control procedure can be leveraged across multiple policies, multiple regulations, and it can be demonstrated and reported on very clearly. When we talk about organizational units, I've had a great opportunity to interact with and talk to a lot of different companies, and it's always interesting to me how these organizations are structured, right? Whether it's by business unit or by brand or by physical location. But aligning your controls and your compliance requirements by those organizational units or in the context of those organizational units, it's really going to allow you to align those compliance procedures to the segments of your organization in which they reside. So that is going to enable you to evaluate how different areas of the company are performing from a compliance standpoint. So even if I take policies and regulations and organizational units together, now that I've got these two bits of data, I could report on compliance just for one policy and one regulation, but I can also run filtering on my reporting, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and I can say, okay, that's great, but how well does organization A help us meet compliance with this particular policy or standard? So as you add more information, it becomes even more useful. Objectives and processes, right? What are those critical business goals, those functions that the control is helping us to achieve or kind of foster a well-behaving environment, right? How well aligned are we with these goals and objectives? So I know from a SOX standpoint, aligning controls with processes is very critical because we're using the financial materiality of that business process to drive whether or not a control is a key control. And through a series of relationships in a database, you would certainly have the ability to do that. And then, obviously, we never really want to leave risks out of the conversation. What are the threats or the opportunities that we're trying to manage, right? What are those unknowns that the control helps us really bring to more of a known state? So it's a very common reason for implementing any control. So we want to make sure that we are properly managing, mitigating, addressing those risks, and this critical relationship between risks and controls certainly can help us do that. So again, this was really just intended to be, just a few of the examples of the key interrelationships that you may want to define and establish. Again, the benefit here is really to be able to report that compliance posture bidirectionally, right? From the control to these impacted elements and from the impacted elements to drive that control's criticality. Okay. So I've already alluded to this, but let's just kind of revisit this topic. Just some of the advantages of maintaining that central controlled control library, like that. So, if we really step back and consider everything, putting everything into some level of structure is really important. And what I primarily am referring to here is capturing each critical control and each critical data point in the context of that organization. What impacts the control, and what does your control impact? That's an important understanding to have, now that we understand why those controls are in place to begin with. Consistency. This is back to, pick on Excel a little bit, but, when people are implementing or inputting all sorts of different data points, it could drive, a lot of inconsistency in reporting or making sense out of those controls very difficult. So consistency is really enabling the consistent documentation and capture of this information. This makes your data more predictable, it makes it easier to analyze, and it makes it more reliable. And speaking of reliability, there's this concept of data integrity. So this is from really two different standpoints. Number one, it's ensuring that the data you need to capture is captured in the appropriate structure at the appropriate time. So in the Excel world, if you want to enforce somebody to pick a list, right, you have to create that list in a separate tab, and then you have to configure the fields that need to pick that list. And then you probably want to hide that tab so that people can't change or manipulate those values. And Someone like me likes to go try to unhide tabs, so you might want to password protect that tab, and now you might lose the password to that. We're not, again, this is not to talk about detailed spreadsheet risks and controls, but I think it deserves to be said that being able to maintain the integrity of how and when the data is captured is really important. And then to take that a step further, we're also talking about this in terms of properly controlling access to the data. When we talk about access, there could be varying levels of access that different individuals in your organization need within the control library. So someone who's just a general business person might just be able might just need the ability to read the controls or know that they're there. But if I'm the owner of the control, I might need to be granted a broader set of rights within that content record. In kind of tying these other 3 points together, when these first 3 elements are met, what you're really gaining out of this is perspective. It allows you to gain insight into your compliance program from all of these different angles, giving you that multidimensional view. So there are real advantages to keeping things very appropriately structured here. Okay. I would imagine that most people on the call here are probably know exactly what they're looking at here. And if you didn't pay attention in geography class, I'm not gonna hold that against you. For those of you who don't know what this is the state of Missouri. So I currently live in Missouri. I've actually lived here for a little over a decade. I really like it. Great place, nice people. Still only one state away. My home state is just over there to the east. And one thing that I've always found about myself is I'm a big lover of U.S. history. So Missouri is a great state to live in if you're fascinated with U.S. history because, let's face it, it's rich with history. So you see up on the top, trust then verify. We've already used that, and we've got this concept of show me. So I'm going to share a quote with you. Now, I know there are some conflicting stories of where the moniker, the show me state came from, which is what Missouri is known as. This is the one that, A, seems to get the most play when I do the research, and B, the one I simply like the best. So this is what I'm sharing with you. I'll let you read the quote for yourself, but basically it was stated by a United States representative from Missouri at a naval banquet in Philadelphia in 1899. And what Representative Vandiver was essentially saying is, you can use all the fancy words and descriptions that you want to tell me about something, but I really don't have time for that. You need to show me. You need to prove to me that, this is actually happening. And frankly, my favorite part about this whole slide is the term frothy eloquence. I hope I have not been dousing you in frothy eloquence and that we've been speaking practically. But what does this mean in the context of our discussion? Well, we're kind of transitioning away from the documentation of the controls and the structure of them to actually getting in and validating that they're operating as intended. So I mentioned that I was an internal auditor formerly, and in those times I had countless discussions with different process owners, and being young and naive, they would tell me, I have the greatest process, I have the best controls, they mitigate all of the risks, you probably don't need to dig much deeper. And again, young and naive, many of those cases I probably nodded my head and said, yeah, you're right. If you say it's okay, then I think we're good. This was much to the chagrin of my supervisors who had to remind me, hey, you're there to audit, you're there to, kind of validate what's happening. And that's where I came to really learn the phrase, trust then verify, right? We can be professional about it, but there is a validation process that needs to be in place. And frankly, it's in everybody's best interest if we put that validation process in place. Trust then verify, or as we say in Missouri, show me. Interesting tidbit, the state of Missouri is one of 2 states that borders 8 other states. The other state would be Tennessee. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, now you know the 2 states in the union that border the most states. Okay. Trust then verify. So talking about testing and validating controls. Now, you guys on the phone are likely all professionals, practitioners. I am not here to tell you how to test controls and how to perform specific testing of your controls. What I would like to explore, though, are those key aspects of establishing a measured approach to evaluating your control environment in the context of this structure we've been talking about. So first, let's discuss prioritization. Now, this takes me back to my year 1 of SOX days, where we talked about every control, we documented every control, we reviewed every control, we tested every control, regardless of how big, small, ridiculous it was. It just was what we did at the time because we just didn't have any other guidance to the contrary. Now, thankfully, organizations like the PCAOB or the SEC have come out and kind of given additional guidance. They're promoting a more risk-based prioritization of controls to help you determine which items are the most critical or crucial in the context of, let's say, your internal controls over financial reporting. But I think the concept of prioritization really applies across the board, regardless of what that goal or that purpose or that driving requirement is behind putting that control into place. Now, this leads me to the next point regarding the nature and the frequency of testing. So there are many factors that can drive how often and to what extent you perform that testing, right, including the overall objectives, the frequency, the design and the structure of the control, among other things. But really, the most important element I would drive home on nature and frequency is consistency, being consistent in how you determine that and how you apply that across the board. Let's talk about design and operating evaluations. I've kept these separate for a reason because, again, another hard lesson that young, naive me learned in the early days was don't test a poorly designed control. So the purpose of the design evaluation is to basically say, hey, before I'm going to go in and start requesting all this documentation and doing all these things to make sure this control is working, I want to make sure that that control is designed well enough to even meet its stated objectives. Right? If that control is ineffectively designed, that issue should really be addressed before proceeding with any tests of operating effectiveness. And then when you consider that operations evaluation or the operating effectiveness testing, it's really important to really document and understand how the performance of that control actually demonstrates that the stated objective has been achieved. And not only that, but then what is an appropriate level of evidence to show that that control has been executed? So when I was younger, it was, hey, if they say that they're reviewing this monthly reconciliation, you have to ask them how they're evidencing it. And then when you pull that data, you need to look for that evidence, right? If that's the way that they're saying this control has definitely been performed, we need to hold them to that. Now, issue identification and monitoring. I'm going to address this very broadly in the context of this conversation, but this is likely going to be a very natural byproduct of any control testing process. We're all human. We all are prone to mistakes and things happening, right? Everything doesn't always happen as we intend it. So the idea is let's identify those issues, let's own them, and let's make sure that they're being properly responded to. When I think about issue identification, right, being able to understand where do I have gaps in my control environment, I think about all of the reasons why I have the controls in place. I'd say this further strengthens that argument for capturing and managing this control library in some sort of structured database. When we were talking about Excel, we talked about potentially having a separate spreadsheet where we're managing findings. How do we maintain that relationship and know which controls are impacted by that? What this would give you the ability to do, if you're thinking about this in a more structured manner, is to give you the ability to easily identify any controls with open or outstanding issues, which is going to drive the level of reliance that others might be taking or placing on those controls. Plus, you also want to identify patterns over time. Is there controls or a series of controls or a particular risk or a particular business unit that constantly causes us fits and causes us problems? Without that sort of interconnection of data, you're going to lose sight of that. So if I could give one overarching theme related to validating, testing controls, that sort of thing, it's really kind of considering what authority ultimately needs to be convinced that the control is operating as intended. So, for example, the level of scrutiny that an external regulatory examination is going to give you, right, is going to be a lot different than that likely than an internal control self-monitoring questionnaire. Now, it's not to say that the control self-monitoring questionnaire should not be treated with the proper level of respect and professionalism. It's just to kind of call out that, there are going to be situations where a deeper and more thorough examination is going to be required. And certainly it never really hurts in these situations to just err on the side of conservatism. Okay, let's talk a little bit about reporting. in monitoring and in evaluating everything that's happening within your control environment, within your compliance program. So a significant benefit of leveraging a central library for these controls, for these key related items and processes and findings and so on, is that you can gain a lot of insight into your compliance program by using a reporting engine. So the reports, they can provide you with the ability to analyze and evaluate your program from a variety of different perspectives, from a variety of different angles. Now, there are some big considerations you want to keep in mind if you think about, okay, well, how am I going to report on this? Especially when you consider that if you think about the reporting need first, a lot of times this is a conversation we like to have at the beginning of a process design or an implementation, because understanding the reporting that somebody needs to do does a world of wonders in terms of informing us, oh, okay, well, here's how the natural design of this database needs to look and needs to behave. So the first thing I would encourage you to think of are the clear goals and objectives. You know, if you ask yourself, what information do I ultimately need to effectively understand and manage this part of my program? That will help you answer that question. And that's going to include a couple of different things. You know, number one, understanding what needs to be reported. Yeah, ultimately, what data points, what information do I need to be able to sort of tell this story? I also want to know who's going to consume the data. So, you know, reports are not necessarily a one-size-fits-all concept. You're going to have executives that want to get reporting at a very, very high level, a very macro level, very summarized. Whereas if I'm someone who's dealing with one particular unit or one particular risk or one particular set of controls, I may need to see that from a different angle. And it never hurts to ask yourself, why is this report important? What is the driving purpose that this report helps serve? Because reports are great, but too many reports are not, right? They can just create noise and kind of gum everything up, and you want to make sure you've got a nice, clean, focused view of the data. Speaking of data, it cannot be understated that you need to consider the data structure that needs to be in place before you ever venture out and be able to produce any sort of good reporting. So for example, if you need a report to be able to demonstrate or show you, hey, these are all of the controls that have not been tested in the last 6 months, well, you'll need to ensure that you can capture data that tells you the date the control was last tested. Now, that's a very simplistic example, but it also presents a very foundational way of thinking through how your solution is structured, how your data is structured, and whether or not the capture of the information is going to support those critical reporting needs. Now, the advice that I give to all clients when building any solution, any workflow, any form, any report is substance over form, right? Function should drive the form. First, make sure what you are producing is properly structured, that it gives you the information required to make critical business decisions. Now, it's not to say that form is not important, right? A lot of people like to rely on the form to tell the story that they need to tell. But form should never trump substance, right? I understand we get into a habit of really liking the way certain reports look, or I'm really used to being able to manipulate this data this way in this Excel spreadsheet, and certainly in some cases there may be trade-offs, but really let function drive form. So again, thinking about reporting as early as possible really can provide big benefits. If I think about the 7 habits of highly effective people, what's the first one? Begin with the end in mind. Understanding these types of needs can help you identify a lot of really critical lower-level business requirements. So a practical example, this won't take very long, but I just kind of want to break down what we've already been talking about and just assume, hey, I want to report on each phase of my SOX compliance process. Well, these are the phases we've talked about today: defining those controls, establishing those relationships, testing, the trust and verify piece, identifying those findings, and so on. So for each one of these areas, there are going to be, I'm going to try to give at least one example of a report. So if I'm defining controls, maybe you're just letting everyone in the organization propose controls, but you want someone on the compliance team to be able to vet those and make sure that, yes, these are the controls that we want to have in place. So controls awaiting review. Using filtering and different methods of presenting the data is going to allow you to produce these sorts of reports. Establishing key relationship. I might want to look at all of my controls grouped by business unit or by business process or by risk. Just taking advantage of that relationship. Those relationships can be so powerful, especially from a reporting perspective. Being able to understand in what context all of those controls exist. When I'm talking about scheduling and executing my testing, if I'm someone who's responsible for evaluating those controls or testing them, a report as simple as my open control tests. I want to see the items that have been assigned to me that are in a state where they're awaiting some action on my part. That's a simple report that does a world of good in terms of informing its user of something that requires their attention. Findings, I find that there's a lot of time-based finding reports, right? Findings approaching the due date, overdue mitigation plans, findings, due in the next 60 days. But you may have findings by severity, by financial materiality, by impact, those sorts of things. Lots of different ways, and a little pro hint, these are the types of reports that executives really love, is understanding what are the gaps that currently exist and what are we doing to manage those. And then just sort of overall monitoring controls. What are my overall controls by compliance status? If I jump a few squares to the left, what are my overall controls by business unit by compliance status? So taking all of these bits of data that you've structured, that you've related, that you've captured, and using them to tell the story, to make the sense out of everything. Again, beginning with the end in mind, I think will really pay dividends. Okay, I know we're getting near the end of our time, so just to kind of sum up what we've discussed today. We talked a little bit about, revisited that what and why of internal controls. Why do we put these things into place? And what are they, and what are the main data points we need to capture? And we do that by stocking our library, our control library. If I think of the Dewey Decimal System, it gives me a nice structure for how all of that information is categorized. It makes it very easy for me to search for it and find it. The same concept can be applied to your control library. How do we structure this information to make it usable and actionable? And a big part of that, again, is setting those key interrelationships. I know I've harped on that a little bit during our time together, but I can't stress its importance. That's really where you start to paint that really intricate picture of what's happening. You're going to want to trust and verify, right? Setting up a testing approach that allows you to scope those controls, to put in testing procedures, testing cadence that makes sense in the context of how important that control is to you, and then leveraging the ability to visualize the results, to bring that information together and give it to the different individuals who are involved in the process in a way that makes it usable and actionable. Okay, well, I've certainly taken up a lot of your time today. I can't stress enough how much I appreciate everyone's participation. And Kyle, I know I've left us about 5 minutes to go through questions, so feel free to fire away.
Thank you so much, Jason, and rest assured that your presentation was eloquent without a hint of frothy. So I think that you hit it right on the mark.
Thank goodness.
So as I mentioned at the start of the webcast, if you would like a copy of the slides that Jason just presented, you can download it from the drop-down menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Now, as we're close to the top of the hour here, we'll move on to the Q&A part of the session. We'll just keep it to one question, and I apologize for that, but Jason has to get to a meeting, and I'm sure many of you also have other meetings to attend, so we'll just keep it to one question. And with that, I'm just going to choose one from the queue here in no particular order. Jason, one question here is, what are the primary considerations to make when determining what data elements are most essential to capture in your control library?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. That's a great question. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's that whole concept, and I said it a few times near the end of the presentation, that begin with the end in mind. If you combine that concept with the whole why do we put controls in place in the first place, right? Thinking about who are we answering to? We're answering to the board of directors. We're answering to management or to a regulator. So that's a logical place to start in terms of, what are those guys expecting to see? If I'm going to go stand up in front of the board of directors and explain to them the status of my compliance program, what are going to be the most important bits and pieces of information that they're going to need to be able to get their own level of comfort and conclude that, hey, yes, we've got a good way for managing these controls. In the SOX world, certainly understanding what your external auditors are expecting. And even just from a more kind of a more operational standpoint, I really think thinking through the reports that you feel like you need to kind of drive that information through its critical reviews, through its processes, that's always really kind of presents a wealth of information about, oh, well, I need to capture these individual data points. So I realize that's kind of a shotgun blast of an answer, but really if you just take the mindset of thinking, okay, why do I have these controls in place and who am I trying to satisfy by putting these controls in place, you'll at least point yourself in the right direction to say, okay, this is who I need to at least go to determine what are those critical data points we're going to need to gather.
Thank you, and thank you so much again for the very informative session. Just so everyone knows, again today our speaker was Jason Rolfe, and I'd like to give a special thanks to OnSpring for making this webcast possible. This webcast has been recorded and will be available later today to Compliance Week subscribers on our website under the Webcast tab, which also contains a library of additional CPE webcasts. If you would like to learn more about subscribing, please contact us at info@complianceweek.com. Once again, to obtain your CPE credit for this presentation, please disable your pop-up blockers in order to access the exam. The webcast will close automatically, and the final examination will be presented in a separate window. If you have trouble viewing the CPE test or receiving the CPE certificate, please send us an email, once again, at info@complianceweek.com. This concludes our webcast. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.